Hello, you're watching TVP World. My name is Sascha Farber. I'm not joined here by Dr. Nora Kürzdörfer, senior researcher at the Munich Security Conference, who focuses on that nexus of economic policy and security. With her and her expertise, we're going to be unpacking and understanding the current state of the EU-China relationship. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. So let's begin with that. How do you assess that relationship right now? It's worth over 700 billion in terms of bilateral trade. Where is EU-China? Where are those relationships heading now?
Yeah, let us start by looking back a little bit. So back in 2019, the European Commission still defined China as a partner, competitor and rival. And I think today the last two elements are becoming much more central to describe the relationship between the two actors. So currently the EU and China are in a tit-for-tat trade dispute, with the EU imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and China then responding with tariffs of its own, but increasingly also by leveraging its control over critical rare earth and minerals and complicating and delaying the exports to other countries, including Europe. So currently I do not really see a resolve for this kind of dispute going on between the two powers.
It's always kind of been said, though, that this relationship, Europe's in the middle, for many years moving closer to China, now away, being pressured now also by the United States. But where is that answer, really? And it's not a unified policy, is it? Different countries in the EU have different policies vis-a-vis China. Will we ever get to a unity with China policy?
I mean, if the EU was ever really forced to find more cohesion vis-à-vis China, it really is now, I would argue. And of course, it is super important that member states are able to speak in one voice. And this becomes even more important considering the pressures from the US. So for a very brief moment of time, actually, there was the assumption that because of the pressures coming from Washington, the EU might move closer to China again. But I think this really is no longer realistic. We have seen this during the last EU-China summit, which took place in July and was supposed to be a celebration of the anniversary of diplomatic relationships between the two actors, but actually did not produce a lot in terms of substance. So there's like some small room for cooperation left with regard to climate, but actually not much is going on with regard to trade and improving the overall relations. So I think what this means for Europe is really that it needs to be able to strengthen its own position now and also to focus its efforts on finding alternative partners, both with regard to Washington and also with regard to Beijing.
So that's a big ask, but nevertheless there's still a lot of trade. There's a deficit actually between the EU and China. There's more being imported right now. I mean, that's a hard thing to get rid of, right? And you're talking about other partners. Where would those partners be? Also on resources. I mean, that kind of decoupling, as we call it sometimes, it's hard to do, isn't it?
Exactly, and in Europe many people actually prefer to say de-risking over decoupling in order to give some more nuance to the discussion and to really show that it is of course difficult to overcome dependence and to kind of divert trade relations away from China. That being said, as I previously outlined, I think it remains important not to deepen dependencies any further, and this is something the EU, of course, also realizes, and this is why the whole ambitions of diversifications exist and were put into practice. And the EU is also really stepping up its efforts in that regard by accelerating negotiations on free trade agreements. We are about to see Mercosur concluded eventually. There's also negotiations with other key countries like India, Indonesia, and so on that have gained traction. But of course, like these long and really complicated negotiations cannot be everything that the EU is doing because we don't really have the time for that anymore. This is why there's also new and more flexible alternatives, and the EU just this year launched the Clean Trade and Investment Partnerships actually in May together with South Africa, and this is supposed to be concluded already in November at the margins of the G20. So this would be really a sign where the EU could show that it's stepping up its ambitions and that it's also able to come to results a bit more quickly than before.
You mentioned stepping up its ambitions, the EU, also about dependency. We look at this major project between China and Europe and well, the world, the Belt and Road Initiative, that's been going on for a very long time. Europe in recent time has also said, well, we have our own gateway now that they're building. So is it still timely enough? Does Europe have, let's say, the capacity to compete with China on the Belt and Road? Where do you see these two? Do we have policy to counter it?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you mentioned this because like a few years ago when I started my research in this area of geoeconomics and so on, I was looking at the Belt and Road Initiative and how the EU is responding to it. And back then, the Global Gateway didn't even have a name, so that was in 2020 still. So it changed over time, and I think it's fair to say that initially the response to the BRI was rather slow. It took some time. But Global Gateway has recently been shaping up, and the EU is really trying to also increase like the financial resources it has in that regard, which is also actually in response to criticism that was often voiced to Global Gateway that it's not able to compete with China just by the amount of finances included and provided. So actually referring back to the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership that I just mentioned with South Africa, that, for example, is supposed to be financed via Global Gateway. And I think that would again be a very important step to show what the EU is now able to do and also willing to do. Mm-hmm.
So steps in the right direction perhaps, but they will take time. Speaking also of pressure again, let's go back to the United States as well. Now, President Trump has also outlined certain sanctions, rather tariffs in this direction also. Those would also have impact on Europe as well. So how do you see Donald Trump's tariff policy and all this vis-a-vis China and how Europe will react to it?
Yes, let me make 2 points on this. One on China and then one on the broader uncertainty all of this causes. So first of all, by basically closing its market to China, the US is pushing China to look for alternative markets, right? It's obvious. So now even more than before, the EU needs to protect its market from the dumping of Chinese overcapacities, which is a problem not only for the European Union, but actually for countries around the globe. Similarly, the on and off approach of Trump's trade tariff policies, and this is my second point, is really causing uncertainty, which makes it very difficult for businesses in Europe, but also in other regions of the world, to plan and to make strategic investments. So this level of uncertainty really goes against the need for having a predictable and rules-based trade order. So I think this is a huge problem which will continue to cause a lot of irritation everywhere in the world. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned also this trade order that we have known. It seems to be very much changing with the mercurial Donald Trump changing that almost daily. But let's look at that pressure again from Washington. I mean, there's a policy that Trump wants to have. He's very strict. He wants everyone to follow. If it's in terms of tariffs, it's in terms of influence. At what point, and I'm also looking at the EU-US trade, let's say, cap, but that again is in question once again. So at what point does that sort of partnership become a liability? Will that pressure at some point push the EU closer to China ultimately?
This is, of course, very difficult. I mean, what the EU has done in response to Liberation Day is that it actually did reach out to the White House. It did enter into bilateral negotiations, well knowing that this would be not well perceived by other countries in the world who know that the EU likes to defend the rules-based system, the global trade order, and so on, and basically entered into a trade deal with the US, where many people argue that it's actually not in line with WTO law. So this is, of course, a problem. We also know that the Commission didn't have many other options. So in a way, it's also understandable that it went the way it did. But what I think is now really important is that now that the US is actually continuing to put pressure onto the EU, for example, by calling on the EU to loosen its digital regulations, that the EU stays firm and also draws some red lines. And I think in the State of the Union speech last week, President von der Leyen send the right signals in that direction. So yes, to wrap it up, I think it's really important that some lines are not crossed.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, as you said, the unity on policy, economic policy is one, political policy as well, for China is different from different member states. I mean, just if we're looking at trade deficits, we're looking at the French and the Germans being very much connected to China more than others. Others have pushed away a bit. If we're looking at Lithuania also with their Taiwan policy as well. So I guess where does this lead in the next few months? Can Europe, and inversely, as you said, Europe as looking at China as an adversary or a partner, how should Europe see itself vis-a-vis China?
So Europe should see itself as a market power, which it is. And by the way, it should also have presented itself a little bit more as a market power in the negotiations with Washington. But it can still do so vis-a-vis China. And it's actually doing so, right? I think there will be no change with regard to the tariffs on electric vehicles, which I think is a good sign. And then, of course, we are all very curious to see the economic security doctrine, which is supposed to come out by the end of the year and is to be kind of a second step after the economic security strategy, and to also include some additional tools of how to deal with China, but also how to deal with other kinds of pressures that are being put on the European economy, but by extension also on the global trade order.
Mm-hmm. I mean, also I want to ask about where you see, let's say we covered some policy areas, but if there's maybe one or two primary ones, if we're looking at European lawmakers, EU politicians, where do you think the most, let's say, priorities lie in the next year? And then also how we square that with the demands of citizens across the European Union.
Yes, so we're here at the Europe Future Forum, so I think it's obvious that I will need to make the reference to defense also, and this is like a new priority for Europe. Not welcomed by many here, but it's pushed upon us from the outside. So I think this will be an area where the Commission needs to find a way to kind of reconcile increased defense spending, and at the same time also making sure that other concerns that are of key importance to many in Europe, like the energy and climate transition and so on, are not lost out of sight. So this is two very important areas, defense and green transition. And then, of course, as I have also already alluded to, the digital sector remains important. And here the EU needs to find a way to not only define itself by its regulations, which I, by the way, think are important and are also a good model for other regions in the world, but to also support its own digital industries more.
Okay, so there's still lots ahead before any sort of, let's say, final conclusions here, but there's lots ahead for Europe and China. Look, thank you so much for joining us here. That was our guest here, Dr. Nora Kürzdörfer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for watching. That concludes this edition of World Talks for TVP World. My name is Sascha Feuerbach. Goodbye.